Go for Leadership, the podcast with Daniel and Gert.
Hello and welcome for today's episode. My name is Daniel and you are part of the Go for Leadership podcast series. With me today is Dr. Steven Mac Gregor.
Go for Leadership interviews.
Steven, nice to meet you and have you on the show.
Hi, Daniel. Pleasure to talk to you today. Looking forward to this.
Awesome. Perfect. Like always, I would ask you for a quick introduction of yourself, Steven.
Sure. Yeah. So I'm an engineer by background. I am based in Barcelona. So I'm talking to you today from my home office in Barcelona. And I've been living here for 20 years, originally from Glasgow, near Glasgow in Scotland. And as you can hear, Daniel, I've completely lost all traces of my Scottish accent after so much time here. So I'm an engineer by background with a specialization in design, which subsequently led me into a kind of my own view of what leadership is and what I try to do with clients. And I can talk about that soon. But the focus for me is in well-being. So I've been working in the field of well-being for 20 years, basically. And that started by looking at the tools of peak performance, let's say. My first book within the space was called Sustaining Executive Performance, before I felt I had the permission to use the word well-being. And then over the years, I've become much more comfortable with the tools of well-being, how we can elevate well-being, let's say, as a more strategic concern within a company. And then that leads then to how I view leadership, which, I can talk about that in a little bit more detail soon. But I think the first thing is how we can look at, making leaders more sustainable, let's say, how they can still lead, still think about the importance of role modeling, building positive culture, but that they don't burn out in the short term and they can show that very positive example to other people within the business.
Awesome. And we are just right at the spot, right? So maybe you can give us a glimpse. How would you define leadership for the audience? Or what does leadership mean to you personally?
So I think there's a couple of things for me, and one is recognizing that it is not about the ego, it is not about the leader themselves. And I think that was something that took hold. I think is lessening much, it's much less than it had been in recent years. I think the pandemic has been important from that point of view, that leaders have recognized the duty of care that they have to other people within the organization, that they recognized and they saw behind the curtain, let's say, when we had so many of these video calls and we saw the individual pain points and pressure points of everyone within an organization. So that's the first thing. The leadership is not about the leader, it's about other people. It is about how the leader develops others so that they in turn can become leaders. So it's not about this I think very typical conceptualization of a leader being this strong, brave leader at the forefront of an organization, which, look, there could still be value in that view. And also, frankly, with a lack of diversity over the years, that view of the hero leader was also typically of a white man, right? And look, I speak, of course, from a position of privilege, but I'm very aware of the privilege that I have of being a white man and also having, additionally, English as a native language. So I've really thought about that in recent years with all of the move towards diversity and inclusion. And even looking into some of the theory on leadership, if you look at the opposite of that hero leader view, then you get something like perhaps servant leadership, right? And you look at servant leadership, which comes from 1970, so over half a century old. But if you look at the 10 traits of servant leaders, active listening, empathy, curiosity in others, all of these things are things that we need absolutely today and absolutely in a post-pandemic world. So that, interest in other people, not a hero, but a servant is one thing. And I think the second thing is just being aware of who we are as human beings. And look, it's a little bit overdone in recent years, perhaps. It's about, everyone talking about how leadership can be more human. But absolutely, in the work that I've been doing in well-being, Daniel, for the past almost 20 years, it's thinking about what are our basic human needs when we are at work. And that's what the background that I get from design thinking, right? So, how can we satisfy the basic human needs that are often compromised within the workplace? And that can come down to the very concrete level. Are you getting enough sleep within the workplace? How is your levels of stress? Are you building enough friendships at work? Do you have a good degree of psychological safety? So all of these things that we need, every one of us as human beings. And I think leaders also need to be aware of some of these things and not just look at upskilling people, make sure that they have the knowledge or the skills for the task, but really look, how can they satisfy the human needs that we all have?
I like that. And maybe let's dig into a little bit deeper of the topic that you just raised of well-being, because I think to have, and you outlined it a little bit, have a good surrounding, have a safe area, safe place to perform and to work. Maybe you can give us as well a deeper look into how you can prepare or set up a culture of well-being, and what tools or methods can you maybe use in order to create such a place?
Yeah, it's an interesting one. I mean, well-being is really such a subjective and complex area, and it's often confused with notions of wellness. And wellness is often used interchangeably with well-being. Wellness for me is about an escape from your daily life, and it's about how you can fix yourself. And wellness is a hugely important industry, right? It's a multi-billion-dollar industry worldwide. But I don't think it helps us because it's about fixing and it's about escape. Whereas I think well-being is about our normal daily lived experience. And of course, if we think about workplace well-being, it's how we think about how we live our lives at work each day. So how can you address well-being in that sense? And over the years, typically companies have well-being programs and they can touch on different things, but it's always very much at the surface. I think, Daniel, it doesn't get to the core of what we need. So it could be, free bananas on a Friday, right? Or something. Or it could be yoga classes or even, smoking cessation programs or weight management programs. Some of these things tend to alienate people. If you have to manage your weight, if you want to give up smoking, it doesn't make you feel better about yourself. So what is the way that we can do it? How can you build that culture? The culture is the key, as you say. And it comes from the leader, right? It comes from the example that they set. So policy is important. Can you build a policy of empowerment, for example, that people feel that they're empowered to do the job to the best of their ability in the way that they see fit, rather than just following examples? There could be different instruments in place, of course, that help elements of well-being, and you can distinguish well-being in terms of physical, mental. Of course, mental health is their mental first aid programs, for example. Many big companies have certified mental first aiders, and you can talk to them in a kind of coaching type of interaction. You have emotional, you have spiritual well-being. Nothing to do with religion necessarily, but linked to notions of purpose. So if someone is at a company, do they feel that they can follow their purpose, and do they have meaning at work? So I think all of that freedom for people to explore their own notions of well-being is what is required to build that culture. And then just finally coming back to the role of the leader in terms of how they role model. So all of these things are great, but if the senior leaders in an organization, if they don't pay attention to some of these things, if they don't pay attention, for example, to the importance of sleep for our physical well-being, and they're sending emails all weekend and they're expecting an immediate reply, or if they're doing other things about shooting down ideas, not giving people the freedom to express ideas or to contribute, then that's going to shut down that culture very quickly. So there's a real role for leadership there to build that culture. And essentially it's about positive culture that drives that well-being, and that well-being, it drives results. It is absolutely going to drive talent attraction, talent retention, engagement from the workforce at large. There's just so many benefits if a company really embraces well-being at its core.
So I like that a lot. You also have published a book called The Daily Reset, and maybe you can give us a little view of what is the content of the book, and maybe also what I would be very interested in is what are your most preferred nudges to share with the audience.
Yeah, so that's just out, The Daily Reset. It's a book, but it's also a journal. I want people to read it, but I also want people to write in it. I want it to make it, make it their own, and really dig into their daily experience in life, and that could be in work or outside the work. And it's a page a day reflection. So you mentioned nudges, so it has a nudge for every day of the year. And the logic behind that is to just help people move forward. I wrote it in 2021 after reflecting on my own experience of the pandemic and just feeling in limbo, right? And I felt that a lot of people had that kind of similar feeling of being stuck, not being able to plan, not being able to move forward because of the restrictions of the pandemic. And I wanted to just summarize everything that I had learned, sharing a lot of personal stories as well, a lot of my own failures, but to just give people the tools, but also the inspiration to just make well-being a part of their daily life. It was also recognizing, Daniel, that people don't read so much these days, so it's a bit of a low bar. All people need to do is pick this up, maybe prepare a coffee, and they just spend 2 minutes every day just reading the day's nudge. And so, those nudges are split into 12 themes for each month of the year. And we are currently in March, so March has the theme of sleep. So there's 31 nudges on sleep to just improve your sleep, experiment with what works for you, understand the science behind sleep, but also some of the case studies that are out there. April next month has the theme of energy and energy management, and leadership has a month. November is the theme of leadership. So in that is 30 nudges on the theme of leadership, and some of those things that I've talked about already before, right? That leadership is about others. The importance of inspiring others. I'm just looking through the book here now. I've got November the 3rd is emotions at work. So it's actually, how much of your emotional self do you bring to the workplace? We tend to let our rational selves dominate our work persona, and that is not always bad, but emotions used well can improve a variety of leadership elements. You bring people closer to you, they get to see that you're a whole person and all of these different things. So there's different ones through that, right? I think there's just one more that I can pull out. November 11th, vulnerability is strength. And this is talking about the case of Arne Sorensen, the former CEO of Marriott Hotels, who sadly passed last year. And it was at the start of the crisis. And he talked about, he visibly came close to tears during that video address, but it was hailed on all sides as a show of strong leadership and not weak leadership, right? So there are different things in there. That isn't just the only theme, leadership being more human. There's the hard-edged part of leadership during November as well. But it's getting people to think about leadership in a broader sense, but more importantly, implement that, and regardless of role. So this could be the most junior person in an organization, but hopefully they would read a nudge and they would just, they would implement that, and they would be the best example of leadership, even if they're 1 month in a company. And I think, that's the most important aspect, that you practice that leadership, right?
I like that a lot. I like also the idea to reflect and to some of my teachers used to say that it takes something every day so that you get something learned every day, a new person. So something that I wanted to also touch base is with you. You also have a lot of experience in changing and cultural development. So what is I think these days really hard. Merit example, spot on. So how to evolve companies, how to let's say change or evolve change. So what skills are required in order to support a company in a change mode or in a restructuring, reformation, however you want to call it?
It's a great question. It's not. Yeah, I mean, it's a tough one, right? How do you do that? I think there's a couple of elements that come to mind. I think one is that aspect of role modeling, so that there's that alignment. So if a company is going to communicate their change objectives, where they want to go to, that the senior people especially are very careful about the behaviours that they show, and that there is a clear alignment that people see. Are they walking the talk? I think that's one thing. Another thing that comes to mind is related to a lot of the work that we do on behaviour change with people on an individual level, and it's recognising that we change through small steps. It's linked to your previous comments, right? If you do something every day, but you just do something, that you show up and you learn by doing. So rather than just, and I think that's the typical approach to change in business, that we give something a huge effort every now and then, but then we just leave it there and we move on to something else. But I think the better thing is these little nudges, right? These little steps. You just give a little push, but you do it consistently and you do it every day. And you get that compound interest effect, let's say, because that effect that builds progressively, and the cumulative impact is hugely important. So I think just taking things a step at a time, and the smaller the change is, also in terms of a neurological level, or synaptic processes in our brain, then it becomes a habit much quicker, and you build that in, and you can forget about it. It just becomes automatic, right? And then I think the third thing is just, and I guess this just comes from my design background, that there's this tolerance for failure in a way. It doesn't have to be kind of right first time, and it's hard to accept something that isn't perfect, and depending on different people's personalities or different people's approaches. But my own background in design thinking was about embrace experimentation, iterate towards the solution, learn by doing. And if you fail, then that's fine, as long as you learn from that failure and you move forward. So I think there has to be part of that flexibility for possible failure, or at least experimentation, because if you don't, you're always doing the same things and you're never going to move forward. So I think with these three elements, that's something that I think would be important in just driving change on an organizational level.
Perfect. As you're also working with a lot of universities and also teaching leadership, I would be also interested on your perspective. How does, let's say, leadership evolved over the time? And you touched base a little bit the servant leadership philosophy that came across some years before. So what is your perspective there, or what you see coming in future?
Yeah, I was really nervous when I started teaching leadership, because I thought, where is the handbook on this, right? I didn't know where to go. Maybe I should have found your podcast to get a start to it, right? But I just, I came from I was an engineer. I was, teaching design thinking, innovation. I dabbled in a bit of kind of corporate social responsibility, and then the opportunity came to teach leadership, and I thought, what am I going to do, right? I was really nervous, and I asked a friend, and he said, look, in his opinion at least, he said, look, there's no leadership 101, right? You take your own approach to that. It's about managing people, inspiring people, and how do you best do that? How do you best develop them? And that made me feel a lot easier. And so then I gave my own view on the leadership that I thought was important, right? And this was starting, several years ago. And so as I'd mentioned at the beginning, I started talking about this element of sustainable leadership, how we can be more human, how we can serve others. And I think that seemed to be received well. That's not to say that anyone else doing or teaching another style of leadership is wrong in any way. But then what gave me more confidence as I moved further into some of that teaching at business schools was finding the whole area of positive organizations and positive leadership. So that I felt was something that I could really anchor my thinking onto. And much of the conversation that we've had already, how you drive positive culture, how you think about other people, how you're more empathetic, and all of these different things. And even though a lot of that is certainly not new, I think post-pandemic, it is something that really has to be dialed up, let's say. It has to be maximized. And a lot of the work around, high performance, psychological safety, talent, flat, more flat organizations than positive leadership, and driving that positive culture, I think, is going to be so important moving forward.
I like that. I think something that I would be also very interested in is to know from you. I mean, in smaller and even also, of course, in larger organizations, there are a lot of leadership programs and courses and studies as well. So how would you describe a very successful leadership development program, or how would you, in a perfect world, implement such a program so to evolve and to support young leaders, young talent to become great leaders?
Yes, it's a good question. It's a good question. How long have you got? I've been very lucky to be involved in the design of many programs over the years at great places, great schools that are ranked very highly in the rankings for leadership development and executive education, also with companies and corporate universities. I think, coming back to, again, my design background and just thinking about experience, people learn best, I think, when they are also having a good time, right? And I think they have to think of the experience of the journey, of the intervention of the leadership development. And so that has to think about different elements. It has to think about in-class learning. It has to think about out-of-class experience, activities that they're doing, even social activities. How do they bond the cohort? I think that's also very important. A lot of the impact of leadership development programs is through the peer-to-peer networking. And regardless of whether that's in the same organization or the same role at different organizations, you build that network and you build relationships between people, because being a leader, especially at a senior level, is a very lonely pursuit, or it can be, right? So having access to other people that you can count on in a non-threatening manner when you have a challenge is hugely important. So those peer-to-peer relationships are very important. And then you tick a lot of the boxes, right? You look at the things that you need to do. You need to look at communication. You need to look at motivation. I think you need to look at well-being and change management and all these things, right? You need to make sure you're covering the bases. But I do think it comes back to that emotional engagement. You stretch people, of course. If you think of flow theory, it can't just be people going on holiday and having a jolly. They have to be stretched. They have to made to be think differently. And so you mix that up with the faculty as well. That's maybe the last thing that I would say. You have a mix of course, faculty experts, but maybe you get speakers, right, that have done something hugely interesting, right, and it shows leadership, but in a non-organizational sense, right, and that also it captures people's imaginations as well. So I don't know, those are some things that come to mind anyway.
I like that a lot. You also have written a book, How Do You Sustain a Collaboration Model for a Complex World? And I think we are in a very complex world these days. I mean, at least in Europe, the big crises are coming even more frequently, right? We have had the banking crisis, we have had the corona crisis, we have now, in certain way, a war in front of our house. So how would you, which tips you would give to leaders these days to survive literally on all these challenges they have?
You've done your research, Daniel. That's going back some time. I don't know what year that was published. That was like 2010 or something. I forgot about that one. No. Yeah, the key concept in that was to innovate. You innovate across different spheres. So the kind of the very well-known model in a lot of the innovation theory of the 90s and beyond was the triple helix model. So that you looked at government, business, and society. But then we looked at a fourth helix, and it was just extending that into triple helix was government, business, and academia, right? And then we looked at the quadruple helix, which added in civil society. So we thought, you can't just innovate with these three, which are, of course, very important. They all have something to contribute, but you need to look at the people on the street. You need to look at civil society. So whether you take that model or not, I think the lessons from there is, as a leader in an organization, to cope with the complexity that we have today, how do you engage across different spheres of influence, right? And society right now is in a huge state of flux. How do you engage with society in general? How do you engage with the end user even? And even on a concrete level for a leader, if you're a senior leader in an organization, there could be bad habits that come into play. For example, that you sit behind a desk in the office most of the time when you're just reading reports, and you don't get out there and you don't see things firsthand. So, what I often say is that 1 minute in the field without any bias or any filters can often beat a 1,000-page report, right? You challenge assumptions. If you're reading a detailed report, yeah, that's interesting. But how do you get into the field? And I think for any leader, that's critical in today's world. You see things for yourself. And depending on your sector, that could mean, going to the store for your company. It can mean going to the supermarket, right? You observe and you keep your eyes open. And I think that helps you to see things as they really are. And you mix that with all the other inputs that you have from all these different other areas. But that's maybe something that I would take from that work that was done a long, long time ago.
I like that, Steve. So maybe my last question that I always like to ask is what advice you would give the little Steven when he started his career? What leadership advice you would give him to become the person maybe that you are now?
Good question. Two things I think come to mind. The first one is friendships. Don't forget about friendships at work. I think it's an old Confucius proverb that comes to mind. It's like, go alone, you will go faster, but go with others and you'll go further. Mm-hmm. And I think maybe at the start of my career, I was laser focused. I just, went as fast as I could manage. And I did all right. And look, it's not as if I did that, or I wasn't interested in making friendships, but I was just going forward, and that was it. But now I'm just much more invested in getting to know the people that I'm working with, even if that's clients, and recognizing that even picking up client work on an ongoing basis, it isn't about results. And that's what I thought as well. I thought you knock it out the park, that's all you need. No, sometimes clients are just happy that it's a job well done, right? And they want to develop a relationship as well, So I think friendships at work is very important, especially in terms of psychological safety and all these things now, right? A lot of young leaders, they are so much under pressure that loneliness is a real key issue for them, right? So invest in friendships at work. And then the other one is just don't be afraid of failure, right? And maybe I should have known that, again, because of my background in design, experimentation, prototyping, and all these different things, iteration. But maybe also when I was starting out, I was just very much focused on, dotting the I's, crossing the T's, getting everything super perfect. Whereas you learn more if you just prototype and you let it go, right? And you just learn by doing and you get stuck in. And that's the approach that I'm doing increasingly now. I'm just jumping in. And when I've jumped, then I kind of figure out how I'm going to land, right? Without thinking about that before I jump, right?
Go for Leadership, the podcast with Daniel and Gert.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Steven, for being our guest today. It has been a pleasure.
Pleasure talking to you, Daniel. Thanks for your time.
Go for Leadership, the podcast.